They called her a ruined bride, until she delivered his calf alone in the middle of the night. The lantern was almost out when I heard her come back in. Not the door I'd have heard. It was her boots on the dirt step, the particular drag of the left one where the sole had separated at the toe, and I knew it the way you know something you've been listening for without admitting you were listening. It was past 2 in the morning. I'd been lying there in the dark with my arm under my head and the ceiling above me and all the cold air coming through the gap at the window frame that I kept meaning to caulk and never did. She'd been in the barn 3 hours. I want to back up because this story doesn't make sense starting from that night. It doesn't even start with her. It starts before her, the way most things do, with what was already broken before the new piece came along. I'd had the place 11 years at that point. Come up from Texas when I was 32 with $40 and a team of mules and a deed to 340 acres of nothing that turned out to be something slowly, over 11 years of mornings that started before light and ended after dark and asked everything of me and gave back in proportion. The cattle were mine. The land was mine. The barn I'd built with 2 hired men and my own back, plank by plank the summer of '81, and I knew every timber in it the way you know your own knuckles. I am telling you this because I want you to understand what the place was to me. It wasn't a ranch. It was a thing I'd made out of myself, out of what I had when I had nothing else to spend. My wife had left in the 8th year. I will not go into it at length. She wasn't a bad woman, and I won't say she was. She was lonely in a way I didn't know how to fix, and after a while she stopped trying to tell me about it, and I stopped noticing she wasn't, and one morning she was gone. There was a note. There was also no note, in the sense that the note said nothing you could put your hands on. So by the time Nora Caswell came onto my land, I had been alone 3 years. She came with a wagon and a man named Fielding who turned out not to be her husband in any legal sense. Just a man who told her he was going to be, and then changed his mind 2 days out of Cheyenne. He left her at the junction of my road and the Belton cutoff and kept on west, and she sat on that wagon box in the middle of August in a dress that was still partly white, because she hadn't had time or occasion to change it, and I found her when I came up to check the line fence that afternoon. The dress had dust on it from the road. There was a cut on her jaw from where I found this out later, struck the wheel hub when the wagon lurched and she'd lost her footing. The town already knew. Word in that country moved the way wind moves, not because anyone decided to move it, just because that's what it does. By the time I brought her to the Morrisons, she'd have had a day and a night, and another day of the sort of looking that carves a person into a shape they don't choose. I didn't take her to the Morrisons, I took her to my house. I want to be plain about why. I want to be plain because I've told this wrong a few times, dressed it up into something it wasn't, or shrunk it down into something practical and bloodless. The truth is I took her to my house because she was sitting on that wagon in the road in August in a ruined white dress with blood on her jaw and nowhere to go, and I have a particular difficulty leaving that kind of thing where I find it. It is not heroism. It is more like I can't walk past a gate that's come off its hinge without stopping to fix it. It is a characteristic, not a virtue. My housekeeper, Mrs. Prout, was away visiting her daughter in Laramie. So it was just me and Nora Caswell in that house for the first 2 days, and I will tell you the town's opinion of that was not mild. She didn't ask for charity and she wasn't soft about anything. By the second morning she had found the broom and used it, and by the second afternoon she'd put a pot on and fed both of us from provisions she'd located in the cellar that I hadn't touched in a month. She didn't cry in front of me. She asked direct questions and answered mine the same way. Her people were from Ohio originally, then Kansas. Her father had run cattle until a hard winter. She knew the work. She stayed because I asked her to, and she asked me why, and I told her Mrs. Prout's wages but that there was more work than Mrs. Prout had ever done. And she said she didn't want charity, and I said I wasn't offering any. That held for 3 months. She learned the ranch the way she'd learned other hard things, methodically, without complaint, with a particular stubbornness about doing things right. She learned which gates stuck. She learned the temperament of the bay gelding, which was not good. She learned when to leave me alone in the evenings and when I didn't mind company, and she calibrated these things without being told, which is a form of intelligence not everyone has. I found myself talking to her more than I'd talked to anyone in years. Not in a flood, not like some dam broke. Just steadily, the way a creek runs in a good year, not remarkable but present. She had opinions about things, and she'd give them to you straight, which I respected. She thought the third pasture was being grazed too hard, and she was right. She thought the roof on the secondary shed needed work before winter, and she was right about that too. The town's opinion evolved without getting better. There was a Mrs. Harlan in particular who had ideas about what was happening in my house, and those ideas traveled. I heard about them at the feed store from a man named Cole who was trying to be friendly about it, and I told him what I thought and went back to my wagon. Nora heard about it too, I don't know from whom. She was quiet the evening after, and I let her be, and the next morning she came to me before I'd had my coffee, while it was still gray out, and told me she could move on. She said it plain, and she held herself straight while she said it. I told her I wasn't going to let somebody else's gossip make my decisions for me. She looked at me for a moment the way you look at something to make sure you've heard it right, and then she nodded once and went to start the breakfast. The heifer was 2 years old and big with her first calf, and I'd been watching her. There were 3 of them that season I'd been watching, but she was the one I was worried about, a red and white with a crooked blaze that my neighbor Akers had called a widow maker when I bought her, and turned out to have been half right. She was difficult without being dangerous, which is almost worse, because she kept you always at the edge of a problem without giving you the clean resolution of one. By November, I was checking her morning and night. I got sick in the first week of November. Not badly, not dangerously, but enough. A fever that came on fast and sat on my chest and wouldn't let go. I was in bed 2 days, which I hadn't been in bed in years. I don't sleep well in daylight. I lay there in a state somewhere between sleep and not, and listened to the sounds of my house and my barn and the wind off the ridge, and some of those sounds told me Nora was doing the work. She came in twice with broth I didn't ask for. She took my temperature. She told me straight that I looked terrible and should sleep more, and I told her I appreciated the assessment. By the 3rd day I was up, which was too soon, but I could stand and I could work, and the heifer needed checking. Nora told me to stay in, and I told her I'd go, and she stood in the kitchen doorway, and I went past her, and that was the end of that discussion. But the fever had taken more out of me than I wanted to admit. I went to bed that night at 9, which I never did, and I went hard. I heard her boots on the step at 2 in the morning. I lay there in the dark. I heard her at the wash basin, the water pouring slow. I heard her cross the kitchen. I heard her at the back door, and I knew from what she wasn't saying, wasn't coming to wake me, that whatever had happened in the barn was done. I got up. She was at the table with both hands around a cup of coffee, her coat still on. There was something dark on her sleeve that wasn't coffee. She had a piece of hay in her hair. She looked up when I came in, and her face was, I don't know, not relieved, not proud, more like someone who has walked a long way and can finally sit down. I said, "What happened?" She said the heifer had gone into labor just after 11. She'd checked her at 9, same as I would have done, and come back out at 11 because something had told her to. The calf was presented wrong. She'd had to turn it. She told me this plainly, the way you report a fact, and I looked at the dark stain on her sleeve and at her hands, both of which she'd scrubbed, but not completely. I said, "The calf." She said, "Heifer cow, she's nursing." I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She said she was sorry she hadn't woken me, and I said she had nothing to be sorry for, and I meant both things, that she had nothing to apologize for, and that I meant the words. Because what she'd done in that barn in the middle of the night with her hands and her steadiness, and whatever she knew about how to turn a calf in the dark, she'd done alone, and she'd done it right, and the calf was alive. I looked at her across the table. She met my eyes and then looked down at her coffee and took a drink. She had a particular way of doing that, holding the cup with both hands, that I'd noticed early on. Something about it was like watching a person who'd gotten out of the cold. I asked her where she'd learned to do that. She said her father's place, said she'd helped with calvings from the time she was 12, said she hadn't known she remembered until she was in there with the heifer and doing it. There was a long silence between us that wasn't awkward. I thought about how to say what I wanted to say, and then I thought about how I'd never found a way to say things like this, and so I said it the plain way. I said, "I need you here." Not in the tone of someone asking, in the tone of someone saying a true thing out loud. She was quiet for a moment. She turned the cup once in her hands. Then she said, "I know." And then she said, quieter, "I'm not going anywhere." She said it to her coffee cup, not to me, but I heard it the way you hear a door closing on a cold wind. A sound that means something has been decided. I sat with her at that table until the coffee was gone and the lamp was low and the sky had started very faintly to come gray at the east window. Neither of us said much. There wasn't much to say. We'd said the important things in the fewest possible words, which is the only way I know to say important things. In the morning I went to the barn and checked the heifer. The calf was a good size, standing on her own, and the heifer was calm. I stood there longer than I needed to. I don't know exactly when I knew what I was going to do. Maybe I knew it then. Maybe I'd known it from the moment she told me she wasn't going anywhere, or from the moment I came into the kitchen and saw her at the table with her coat still on and hay in her hair. Maybe I knew it sometime earlier and had just been refusing to look at it the way you sometimes don't look directly at a thing because you know it'll change everything once you do. I asked her in December. The month was cold and the ground was frozen, and I'd fixed the window frame at last, the caulking job I'd put off for 2 years, and she was at the table with her sewing when I came in and sat down without taking off my coat. I told her what I wanted and what I could offer. I was careful about it because I wanted to be honest, and I didn't want her to feel obligated, and I didn't want to dress it into something it wasn't. I said, I know you came here because you were stranded. I know you stayed because I asked. I'm asking different now. I'm asking because it's what I want, and I think it might be what you want, and I won't think less of you if it isn't. She looked up from her sewing. She said, it's what I want. She didn't say anything else. She went back to her sewing for a moment, and then she set it down, and she came around the table, and she sat next to me on the bench, and she put her hand over mine on the table. Her hand was warm, and there was a callus on the side of her thumb from the seam work. She just kept it there. I looked at her hand on mine. I thought about 11 years of this land and the barn I'd built, and the cattle I'd grown and all the mornings that had started before light. And I thought about the last 3 years of doing that alone. And I thought about my wife's note that said nothing you could put your hands on. And I thought about a woman who'd gone into a dark barn alone in the middle of the night and turned a calf and come back in and sat at my table and told me she wasn't going anywhere. Outside the window, the last of the light was going off the ridge. The land was blue and hard with cold and perfectly still. I turned my hand over and held hers. That's all there is to it. The rest has been the same land and the same work and a different quality of morning, and I don't need to go further than that because you already know how it feels. If you've ever had somebody who stayed, you know. There's nothing to add. The heifer's daughter is still on the place. 12 years old now, same crooked blaze, still a little difficult.